thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure for all of us to be here, I hope. It's very nice to see so many distinguished scholars and so many friends. And Liz has made this evening of celebration possible, so I should make a special remark of thanks to her. Well, Liz mentioned that the students have been working fabulously well all today with a very large number of Darwinian events, and they're due to conclude at about 9 o'clock tonight, when the final paragraphs of The Origin of Species will be read. They began at about 10 o'clock this morning, so they've been working hard at it. It's not the same ones, but there's been a lot going through the book. And like all Harvard students, they've been fabulously inventive. You may have seen a gorilla in the yard today. We had one in class. You may have had a photo opportunity with 3 Mr. Darwins here. And for us tonight, there's a special resonance in meeting in this historic museum the Temple to Nature's Laws that Louis Agassiz founded in 1859, the same year that Darwin published his famous book. Agassiz never accepted Darwin's proposals, as you know, but my goodness, he knew how to make a natural history museum. The first of its kind in the United States, and very remarkable for representing the animals of the world room by room, as if they were in their native regions. It's a historic place of which we're very proud, and for me it's a real privilege to be here. This image, taken in the 1970s, a black and white photo, as you can see, purports to show Darwin's ghost. It's taken at midnight with an infrared camera by a very reputable ghost photographer. And the house and garden are not Darwin's, but they are recognizably a house very close to his in the village of Down in Kent in England. And according to the text which goes with this, written by the photographer, Darwin can be seen here in his hat and cloak with his walking stick and his telltale beard. And I would be very grateful if anyone can spot him. Because I've looked and looked, and in fact I've shown this in class, and we've looked together as a group, and we've had a number of suggestions that there's a chimpanzee in here, and several other things, but possibly there is something going on round here. Okay. And it's the ghost of Darwin that concerns me tonight. Not in a literal sense, although the existence of this photo and its claim to depict a man who didn't believe in ghosts is really very interesting. So if Darwin is in this picture, he would be very disgruntled. And I wanted instead to use it as a metaphor for thinking about history. Because most of history, or much of history, consists of tracing what people thought they believed, what they thought they saw, and the impact of certain figures or events long after their time that gathers up a kind of steamroller effect. It's the historian's happy task to bring people alive again, to recreate them for a new generation of readers, and to explore the different ways that specific figures or groups of figures have been regarded. And in Darwin's case, it's fascinating to see how he created a system of thought that not only shook the world that he lived in, but also presented ideas that became an integral part of the great transformations of the 19th and 20th centuries, changing the way we think about ourselves and the natural world. And I want to move from this to say that Darwin isn't a ghost to us. We only have to think of what we've been enjoying today. He's not a ghost. He's more than real to us. He's as present in our modern minds as he ever was when he was alive. And there is, for example, a city called after him in Northern Australia. There's a university college in Cambridge also named after him. There's a high-level computer program named after him. A Dutch rock band named after him. We've got grad students onto this one, and we're looking to get some of their music. A company. With this, the very famous sequence of evolutionary forms at the top. I have it on my front. Many of us are wearing this kind of imagery today. There are other sorts of food stuff. A very powerful British beer, Darwin's Downfall, and here you'll notice, very witty label, the sequence of evolutionary forms goes the other way. Darwin's Downfall. And many of you in the biological world will know of the Darwin Awards, which is a humorous, web-based annual award that notes those people who have inadvertently contributed to natural selection. There are other ways of displaying your allegiance. As we know, here is a great number plate that I would like to have, and something very interesting, that this is a young woman who I actually met, who had, in celebration of her PhD in anthropology, run out and put Darwin's first illustration of his evolutionary thought. See Darwin, 1837, down at the bottom. Well, not at the bottom, but it's on her side. Lovely. And of course, there's always the cartoons. This is from the New Yorker, 18 months ago by now, showing the typical juxtaposition of themes that's very characteristic of cartoons of all kinds. Darwin is here portrayed as King Kong on the top of the Empire State Building, being attacked, as we know he is in the modern day, we imagine by planes piloted by creationists. So it's juxtaposing several issues together. The cartoons are a very fertile way of showing how much Darwinism, evolutionary thought, has become embedded in our world. There are a zillion different kinds of postcard. Many of you will know this postcard where the man at the end of the evolutionary sequence says, "Are we nearly there yet?" Other versions of this, more topical. And if we add a dash of gender studies, there are these kinds of moving images available. Show that again if you like. And Darwin is enough of a national hero to the British that you find him on the £10 note, that he will be there for another few months. He's likely to be taken off in 2010. I did ask about that when I was back last year. And he's been there for a good long time, and he is currently the only scientist on the British currency. You will notice, perhaps, if you study it carefully, that it shouldn't really be a hummingbird there. I'm sure they took advice, and it's very beautiful, but it surely should have been some finches. If you go to England this summer, this will possibly get you a cup of coffee. And in all this, and there are many other images that we could have chosen, but in all this, Darwin's evidently being used to represent far more than the man himself. He's come to embody not only the theory of evolution, but many of the ideals of modern science. Even if we're one of the 40% of North Americans who doubt the truth of evolutionary theory, these visual references need no explaining. Darwin and the theory of evolution, whether we believe it or not, have become part of our modern consciousness. And that's where I want to dwell tonight. What are we to make of this high visibility, past and present? And of course there's the theory. This is The Origin of Species, the book that we're celebrating this year, the sesquicentennial of publication of The Origin of Species. This is the first edition. This is actually photographed from Darwin's copy. You can see the Cambridge University Library call mark up at the top there. Of course there's the theory, a magnificent achievement that lives on as the central organizing concept of modern biology. We had a fabulous lunchtime symposium organized by the students today, where they invited 5 professors round and about Harvard to come and talk about the way they use Darwinism in their work. It was so interesting. His achievement really does live on. You don't need me to tell you that. In 1859, also, the clarity and the insight of Darwin's vision in this book provided real answers to the biggest natural history problems of his day. And forgive me if you already know this remark from Alfred Russel Wallace, but it's a wonderful remark about Darwin's achievement. Even Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently formulated the same idea of evolution by natural selection, said of The Origin of Species, "Mr. Darwin has given the world a new science, and his name should, in my opinion, stand above that of every philosopher of ancient or modern times. The force of admiration can no further go." Now, he may have been exaggerating, but it's clear that Wallace, who was most qualified to judge, thought it was magnificent. And since 1859, the idea of evolution by natural selection has, of course, had its ups and downs, but over the long term, it's dramatically expanded in scope and in the range of evidence that supports it. So despite all the changes, or maybe because of them, the key principles remain intact. Darwin and Wallace made a truly remarkable joint announcement in 1858, and Darwin's Origin of Species, published the year afterwards, has demonstrated its explanatory power for 150 years. It's really an extraordinary accomplishment. And since we're in commemorative mode tonight, I'd like to review some of the main moments of that extraordinary accomplishment before turning to some thoughts about commemoration in general. And it'll be a lightning overview, but I'll try to indicate where recent research has made a difference to the customary story. So here is our man, younger than the image we have here. You sometimes see this reversed, the other way around. This is the right way. He's born 12th of February, 200 years ago. He was the 5th child and the 2nd son of Robert Waring Darwin and his wife, Susanna Wedgwood. They were a very prosperous family. They lived in Shrewsbury, in Shropshire, in central England, slightly to the west of England, quite close to Wales. And this is the house, an old photo, because the newer photographs are unfortunately disfigured by the signs that indicate it's now the local tax office for Shrewsbury. And you can visit inside, but it's actually quite easy to visit inside, but it's a nice old picture that gives a sense of the family background. This is a pastel drawing that is the first image of Darwin as a child. It was the only image of Darwin as a child in 1816, just a moment or two after his mother died. Darwin was actually brought up by his older sisters, and he always remained very fond of them, and there's no obvious sign of permanent trauma from the death of his mother. historians have always been interested in the fact that he had two very famous grandfathers, Erasmus Darwin, the poet, philosopher, medical man, and evolutionary thinker, and Josiah Wedgwood, a liberal industrialist who founded the pottery firm that used to be very prosperous and only a month ago crashed. They had bought up a glass company and weren't able to pay for it and just had to fold. So the Wedgwood Company has gone, but nevertheless, in those days, the early days, and continuing through into Darwin's own lifetime, it gave the family a very handsome private fortune. And although they could have become very conservative, this family is notable for its liberal political stance, for its commitment to the anti-slavery movements, both in the early years of the 19th century and through the 1830s. So Darwin came from a background that encouraged science. His father was a doctor. There was a strong sense that the children should grow up as intellectuals. He went to Shrewsbury School, a local school, followed by Edinburgh University, with the intention of becoming a physician. And we know this shape of his story, of course. I know you know this. And I just wanted to say that Darwin's autobiography is the source for a great deal of our opinions on these times in his life. And in his autobiography, Darwin claimed that his time at Edinburgh was wasted, that he hated the medical curriculum, that he dodged out of class whenever he could, and he recoiled from the first sight of an operation. And within a few months of arriving, he had decided he didn't want to pursue medicine, but that he wouldn't quite yet tell his father, and he would enjoy himself pursuing natural history whilst he was there, which he did do. And recent research outside his autobiography, outside his own self-construction, shows that he left Edinburgh University after 2 years there, very accomplished in natural history. He had attended lectures, he had studied ornithology independently, he had been working in marine biology with one of the very famous biologists of the day, Robert Grant. He had learned chemistry and geology. But nevertheless, the story is that he went home. His father discussed with him, what now? If not medicine, what are you planning? And after some discussion, it appears to have taken several months, Darwin and his father agreed that he would go to Cambridge University with a view of taking an ordinary degree, which was the first step towards becoming an Anglican clergyman, with a view to going into holy orders. And several members of the family were country parsons, rather secular country parsons, but they were country parsons, including his cousin, William Fox, who was training to become a parson, who was also at Cambridge a few years ahead of Darwin and became his closest friend. And Darwin certainly recognized the irony later on and expressed a few hesitations at the time about some points of doctrine, but in general he seemed pleased enough with the idea of a future in the church. And this is where he went, Christ's College, Cambridge. And again, Darwin said that his time at Cambridge was completely wasted too. But he was misremembering, or in fact maybe even constructively obliterating his debt to the professors who taught him there. In particular, the professor of botany, John Stevens Henslow, and the professor of geology, Adam Sedgwick. And Henslow's lecture notes have recently surfaced from the depths of the Cambridge University Library. And it seems that Henslow was much more interesting than we've given him credit for, that he was full of the latest physiology and taxonomical thought from France, and that he was one of the first in Europe since Jean-Baptiste Lamarck to suggest that animals and plants were united right at the bottom of the taxonomic tree. And similarly, Darwin's experiences with Adam Sedgwick, the geologist, provided one of the best possible educations in field geology that a young man could hope to obtain. He graduated in 1831 with a fine practical knowledge of natural history. And much of this, like in Edinburgh, was acquired through his strong amateur interest that he pursued natural history outside the curriculum in collecting natural history specimens, particularly beetles. And you may know this image from Cambridge University Library, from the manuscript collection there. It's in a letter to Darwin. It's from one of Darwin's university friends during his university time at Cambridge, saying, or at least asking him, have you found any good beetles this summer? And you'll see the far image here is labeled Darwin on his hobby with the butterfly net, beetle net, and here he is on a beetle with the milestone behind him saying 1 mile to Cambridge. So it's a very nice sense of who he was through the eyes of one of his friends. So I'm stressing that Darwin had a really good background in the natural history sciences, because when the invitation to join the Beagle came in the months after he graduated, it's no surprise that Henslow thought Darwin would be the very man to accompany the expedition. Now, Henslow thought that, but Darwin's father objected. You may know this list of his father's objections, but it is quite nice to show it to you. This is Darwin's handwriting, and it appears that his father spoke to him about why it would not be a good idea to accept this invitation, and that Darwin agreed with his father and sent a note, a polite note, saying, I withdraw from this invitation, and then went to visit his uncle, another Josiah Wedgwood, the uncle who eventually becomes his father-in-law. And the uncle Wedgwood asked Darwin to write down what his father had said. So that's why we have this list. Rather long set of reasons, but nevertheless it's a great thing that we still have this list. And I just like them very much. I won't read them all, but perhaps you could just look at the top one where the father, this is the voice of the father, disreputable to my character as a clergyman hereafter. A wild scheme that they must have offered to many others before me, the place of naturalist. And so it goes on down to the bottom, and again you hear the father's voice. It's a wonderful document, that it would be a useless undertaking. So this is a very vivid document, and of course, Uncle Wedgwood persuaded Darwin's father that the boy should go, that it was a wonderful opportunity, and indeed, off Darwin went, as we know. And this, I'm going to be through these high points of the Beagle voyage. The Beagle, as you know, changed Darwin's life. Its captain was Robert Fitzroy, who has been unfairly represented in the historical record as a raving fundamentalist. He certainly believed, he certainly expressed his views, but it's only after the voyage that Fitzroy became deeply committed to a literalist account of the Bible. Stories of them arguing in the cabin throughout the voyage about the creation of species or about the literal truth of the Bible are mostly inaccurate. Fitzroy, like Darwin, was deeply impressed by the geological work of Charles Lyell, who was writing at exactly those years that the Beagle set out from London. Lyell's principles of geology offered a new view of thinking about the Earth that rested very much on the idea that many small and gradual changes would accumulate into large effects. And when we look about us at the landforms of the Earth, we only see those large effects, and it takes a great reshifting of the vision to understand this has come about over many, many epochs, just by the accumulation of tiny changes. Darwin was deeply impressed by this methodological principle, and in fact, one of the most important findings of research into the Beagle voyage is to explore the way that Darwin used that motif of many small changes adding up to big effects. He takes it out of, he uses it within geology to explain what he sees in geological terms, but he also takes it out of geology to start explaining the biology that he sees, and indeed even to explain some of the variety of human beings that he meets. He uses that principle for the rest of his life, and we can see it echoed, of course, in The Origin of Species and the theory of natural selection. Lyell, very important. Darwin's work on the Beagle voyage took much of its tone from his geological interest, and here is a map of his from the Darwin collections at Cambridge, with his own colouring done during the voyage, indicating areas of subsidence. The blue all down the east coast indicates subsidence. He was very lucky in finding fossils, giant fossils, fossils of forms that could still be found in the same areas but much smaller. So there were a kind of a chronological link between the past and the present, although not the same species. He galloped around. He had a wonderful time. His letters home suggest that he really did have a wonderful time. Very exciting, full of adventure, this voyage. And went out with the gauchos many times seeking this rhea, and as well as thinking about the way fossils were arranged in time, he began to think about the way organisms, living organisms, were arranged in topographical space. And this bird was one of those that he thought about. He thought about the humans he was meeting, particularly in Tierra del Fuego. On the Galapagos Islands, as we know, he was deeply interested by the tortoises, by the iguanas, by the volcanic remains that he was finding, and interested enough in the birds, but not enough to label them individually from the islands where he visited. He put all the birds, all the little birds, in one single bag and was content to label them just as Galapagos, so that when he returned, unsettled by the idea of variation and adaptation, diversification, when he returned, it was the work of the naturalist John Gould in March 1837 that really tipped him over the edge towards evolutionary thought. The finches were a very significant part of his transition into evolutionary thought, but not so much on the Beagle voyage. It was mostly an event that happened afterwards. So Darwin learnt to look, he learnt to collect, he learnt to think during that voyage, and something that has emerged in the last 5 or 6 years, most significantly, he learnt to write things down. And here is just a small sample of the records of that voyage. Darwin became a man who wrote. It's wonderful for historians, of course, but it's something that he used as a way of accessing information and manipulating information. He didn't have a computer, but he wrote things down in different places. He filed them. He kept everything orderly. As well as the notebooks, he had some Beagle notebooks. He had some notebooks that we now call transmutation notebooks, where his evolutionary thoughts were worked through. this is his first attempt at visualizing evolutionary change. In fact, the same image that we saw on the young woman's torso. When he arrived home from the Beagle voyage, he threw himself into work. Again, this is something that the historians are truly now appreciating, that Darwin was a devil for work. He really worked hard. Through these years, he continued to write everything down, and to the great advantage of historians, we find that personal things were written down also, and that several months before he proposed to his cousin Emma Wedgwood, he wrote, for example, this kind of balance sheet, asking himself whether he should marry or not marry. This is the question. And he may have had Emma in mind, or he may not. We're not entirely sure. And on the side of not marry, he lists the disadvantages at the top, and then there's all the advantages of not marrying. Freedom to go where I like. Not forced to visit relatives. Loss of time, and cannot read in the evenings. And then on the other side, the plus side for marriage, there's a number of very nice reasons. He would have a companion, he would have someone who would love him, he would have someone who would look after him. And then he says, better than a dog, anyhow. And then towards the bottom of the marry side, he says, it would be intolerable to spend one's life like a neuter bee. And right down at the bottom, on the left-hand side, you may see marry, 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 QED, quadrilateral demonstrandum. So here's who he marries, Emma Wedgwood, his cousin, and a few months older than him. They had a very long, happy, sustaining relationship. Interestingly, they probably only fell in love after they had got engaged. It's a rather Victorian way of going about things. They moved to the country. They had a large family. And during this time, Darwin was writing his books, but also thinking through his theories. And I simply wanted to mention here, whilst I'm hurrying on through, that it's often said Darwin delayed publishing, that he had the germs, the gist of his theory, in hand, certainly by 1844, when he wrote it out as an essay that he gave to his wife Emma to publish if he should die. Why? Well, nowadays it's much more common to think that there is not delay, that Darwin was a different kind of person, that he was so conscientious, so aware that this was a difficult, dangerous, hard theory to understand, that it needed all the evidence he could possibly supply. And in a very courageous step, he dedicated himself to finding that evidence. He developed a tremendous correspondence network all over the world. He tried to do as much experimental work as he could in his gardens. Here he used pigeon breeds in order to hybridize the very prominent different fancy breeds of the mid-Victorian period. He crossbred them, trying to reduce them back down to the original pigeon form. He wasn't very successful in that, but he was trying to provide the evidence. He spent 8 years on the taxonomy of barnacles. Again, he had only begun with one barnacle, but he decided that he needed to understand the whole of the barnacle world, living and fossil, pedunculated and sessile, before he could explain this one single aberrant form that he had brought back from the Beagle. And as he worked through these 8 years, he understood that he was giving himself the classificatory, the taxonomic expertise that would allow him to speak about species with authority in his world. And he used letters very extensively as a research tool. Now I really am going to scamper through. Wallace wrote to him in 1858 with an essay that appeared to Darwin to completely recapitulate his own theories. This is an entirely fictitious image done in 1955 by a Russian biologist. It interestingly shows Darwin reading Wallace's letter with his two friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, beside him. It was Lyell and Hooker, as you know, who persuaded Darwin not just to publish Wallace's essay, but to add his own writings to that, so that there would be a joint announcement of evolution by natural selection that Hooker and Lyell organized to take place at the Linnaean Society of London on the 1st of July, 1858. Darwin then turned to the writing of The Origin of Species that was published on the 24th of November, 1859, followed by a storm of controversy. The controversy included the United States of America. Since we're standing in Agassiz's kingdom, we ought to mention that this controversy in the United States began with words being exchanged between Louis Agassiz and Asa Gray, the great botany professor here in Harvard. They apparently, when Gray arranged for Darwin's work to be published in the United States, Gray had actually received a copy directly from Darwin. The very first one that arrived in the United States came here to Harvard, and it was read, for those of you that would like to know, in the basement of our Boylston Hall, which was the apartments, the academic rooms of Jeffries Wyman. And they say, Gray says, that they grew warm in Wyman's room, around Wyman's fireside, Christmas 1859, discussing the new book of Mr. Darwin's. And the company was James Russell Lowell, Henry Torrey, Charles Eliot Norton, and Asa Gray and Jeffries Wyman. They also report that Agassiz was overheard saying, "It's poor, very poor." So this is the story with which we're all familiar. I'm sorry that it's taken us quite some time to get through it. Yet, history tells us that Darwin wasn't the only one to think of evolution. There were important evolutionary thinkers before Darwin's time, including his own grandfather and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and increasing numbers of thoughtful proponents in his own lifetime. The idea of progressive development was commonplace in the 10 years before Darwin published, especially in France. In Britain, thinkers like Baden-Powell, Robert Chambers, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was actually in Indonesia at that time, and Herbert Spencer were deeply engaged with questions that we now see as evolutionary. And even the phrase that we most associate with Darwin, the expression survival of the fittest, wasn't his. It was coined by Spencer, the great philosopher of biological progress. And history also tells us that interest in Darwinism rose and fell in the decades after Darwin's death in 1882. The theory fell out of favor around 1900 when the new genetics came into being, and again in the 1950s when molecular biology emerged. And it's increasingly suggested by historians, especially Peter Bowler, that Darwinism actually needed a number of intellectual boosts. In computer terminology, we might say rebooting at strategic moments in the 20th century in order to become the theory that it is today. And that the need for these boosts has been obscured by the very success that evolutionary theory has today. So it seems possible, and I want to explore with you tonight, that Darwin anniversary celebrations over the last 150 years might have been used in part to re-establish the relevance of natural selection at particular delicate moments. And I think just to start, that Darwin's funeral might well have been one of those moments. Darwin was buried in 1882 in Westminster Abbey, the first such event available for national glorification, as Jim Moore has demonstrated. The active scientific reformers in the Royal Society, like Huxley, his great friend, Francis Galton, his cousin, the eugenicist Francis Galton, and John Lubbock, his neighbour, moved rapidly to get permission to bury Darwin in Westminster Abbey, one of the primary religious buildings in Great Britain. It's a far cry from the simple funeral that Darwin had anticipated in his village church. And this Abbey funeral service, and many of the obituaries, stressed that Darwin was not irreligious, that he was a good man committed to truth and honesty. The choir sang a psalm, "Happy is the man who possesseth wisdom," which was valuable propaganda at a time when the relations between science and religion were intensely fraught. So the men at the Royal Society in 1882 used Darwin's funeral, I'm suggesting, as a way of asserting the importance of science in the high Victorian period. They turned a man who was a self-acknowledged agnostic into a national hero with full religious ceremony. Now next, in England, I want to turn to the Natural History Museum in London, because this was the first academic institution to stake a claim on Darwin by erecting a magnificent marble statue by Joseph Boehm in the central hall of the museum, exactly where the high altar would be if this was a cathedral. Let's just look. I'll show it to you in just one moment. The structure of the building is it is modeled on a Romanesque cathedral, on a Greek temple, as many other natural history museums are. The ceremony, the unveiling, was conducted by Huxley, who you can see here, very characteristic. Oh, where's my red light gone? Very characteristic representation of Huxley here. Still in his prime as Darwin's bulldog. Now, the reason that the Natural History Museum was so quick off the mark was that it was losing intellectual authority to the new experimental and developmental sciences in the universities. The focus of science was shifting to the universities. It didn't seem the old natural history tradition of observation, collecting, did not seem to be cutting edge any longer. And by erecting a statue to Darwin, the museum hoped to regenerate pride, both in British brainpower and in the collection and systematization of facts. But Darwin's moment in the museum didn't last all that long. 40 years later, in 1927, a new director came in who was keen to dissociate the museum from mere natural history, and Darwin was demoted from his altar, and he was moved to the cafeteria. However, this has a happy story. He's back again. I owe this image to Jim McCarthy, who very kindly sent it to me. Darwin was reinstated back at the altar in 2008 in preparation for this year, and you can see him here in the center of the stairwell with this kind of green halo behind him. So I'm very glad that Jim went there last year and got that picture for me. Now I'm going to move on. One of the most important commemorations came about in the interwar period, when plans were set in motion to buy Darwin's old home for the nation. There were protracted financial difficulties, during which time Thomas Hunt Morgan, the great American geneticist, stepped forward to offer American support, which was turned down by the Royal Society of London. And then a British surgeon, a wealthy surgeon who had lost his son in the war and had nowhere to give his money, stepped in and financed the purchase of this house and its refurbishment as a museum in 1929. And here is the opening ceremony in 1929. And this was during a period of marked change and uncertainty for British science. One can think about the way the house was restored as presenting reassurance in an age of anxiety. The peaceful ambiance, the traditional gardens, the very homely furnishings encouraged visitors to think that world-class science, that Darwin's brain power wasn't threatening, it wasn't even political. And at Down House, science could be humanized as patient observation, meticulous research, and needing minimal laboratory equipment. This is Darwin's study as it was then recreated. It's been upgraded since then. It's a very fine photograph. It's very evocative. I myself find this a wonderful image. And you can see that Darwin here has almost recreated his Beagle cabin, that here he is, it's a masculine place, it's enclosed, it's personal, it's private. It's where he thought. And here are his friends over the mantelpiece, his relatives and friends, his wife in an image down the side here. Here is his portfolio of notes, and here is the chair in which he wrote The Origin of Species. Here is a stuffed dog. I can't quite see that. We're losing my red spot. Down at the bottom here. Here is his dog waiting for him to finish the writing and go out for a walk. The dog was refurbished ever such a long time ago. And so as the world became modern in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, this house suggested that all Darwin had needed for his great work were his eyes and a pencil and paper. And then, just to bring us up to date, in 1959, 100 years after the publication of The Origin, it was the turn of the United States. In the wake of the evolutionary synthesis of the 1940s and Ernst Mayer's influential book, our very own Ernst Mayr, Systematics in the Origin of Species, 1942, the Darwin anniversary of 1959 was held in Chicago. And this celebrated many things, but it particularly celebrated the integration of selection theory with genetics and populational statistics. And here we have a number of the individuals concerned. Ernst Mayr is the fifth from the left. There's Julian Huxley in the middle. There's Sewell Wright on the far side here. Dobzhansky's over there on the left. It was almost as if UNESCO or its precursor, the League of Nations, had come together to make a treaty between the various elements of evolutionary and biological science that were pulling apart through the 40s. So 1959 celebrated the way they were now united, moving forward together. The story of Darwin's finches becomes very widely distributed at about this point in time. David Lack had been in the Galapagos studying the finches and then writing about them afterwards through the 1940s. The second edition, in which he calls them Darwin's finches, was published in the late 40s, but the story of the finches, the thought that they were Darwin's finches, that they were the evidence that Darwin stumbled upon on the Galapagos, emerges during these 1959 celebrations. The peppered moth is also broadcast very publicly at this time too. There were other elements that we perhaps don't really have time to go into, but considerable pressure during this meeting and immediately afterwards was put on Ecuador to allow the Galapagos archipelago to become a World Heritage Site. There were many archives donated to different libraries through this period also, and biographies began to be written. So it's a time in which modern selectionism was actually created. These individuals rejected any form of directed evolution. They kick Lamarck right out of the story, and they expand Darwinian thought to cover the evolution of mind and behavior. And during the conference, Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, gave a secular sermon in the style of his grandfather and declared that religious belief was just a biological adaptation. And others promoted the idea that the natural world and ourselves could only be understood through science. And here I'd just like to pause and say thank you to the researches of one of our graduate students in the history of science, Melissa Lowe, who's been in there in the Harvard archives in the Ernst Mayr papers, and she has found that in Mayer's Nat Sci 140 classes at Harvard in 1959, that he told his students that opposition to the evolutionary theory has died down almost completely. So we're in a different world now. That kind of confidence could be expressed now, but it would not be accurate. Now here we are in 2009, the bicentenary of Darwin's birth and 50th anniversary of the origin of species. Anniversaries, as historians Peninia Aber-Am and Clark Elliott have reminded us, are big business. They've long been acknowledged as strategic events for promoting culturally significant agendas. They help us in how we would now think about the construction of memory. Anniversaries, the celebration of anniversaries, reveal a wish to establish a collective identity on the basis of some shared descent. They also set out our anxieties. They shape our collective desires for the future. So what of the celebrations this year? What about today? Governor Patrick Deval, perhaps you saw it today, has officially declared today as Darwin Day throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. What do we make of that? Down in the Holyoke Arcade, just for today only, you could get a Darwin vegetarian pizza. What do we make of that? And it seems churlish to mention all the other anniversaries that are temporarily obscured by Darwin's 200th, such as the birth of Abraham Lincoln, as well as Felix Mendelssohn, Kit Carson, the frontiersman, Alfred Tennyson, the poet, Benjamin Peirce, the professor of math here at Harvard, and William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister 4 times over. And there were other books. It's not just The Origin of Species that was published in 1859, of which John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and George Eliot's Adam Bede, maybe even Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, came out the month after Darwin, stand out. And even Jean-Baptiste Lamarck has an anniversary this year, commemorating his most famous work, the Philosophie zoologique, published in 1809. So I have been very interested, as a historian and as a sort of anthropologist of science, if you will, what it is today that we're doing. Are we making a statement about our belief that evolution is true? I think we are. Scientists throughout this year will surely hope to establish beyond any further doubt that the theory of evolution has never been stronger or more useful in their work. And while we can all acknowledge that the Darwinian revolution was not solely due to Darwin, and even that it might not have been quite as revolutionary as the popular press suggests, Darwin's work has nevertheless become one of the most potent symbols of modern science, with Darwin himself being seen as an icon of rationality, a figurehead for rational endeavor, behind whom it's become necessary to muster. 50 or 100 years ago, this sense of defensiveness, this sense of necessity would not have been felt so strongly, if at all. And today the situation is different, in that evolution faces intense criticism. Many supporters of evolutionary theory in the United States will surely welcome the opportunities offered by this anniversary year to explain Darwinism more widely and more publicly than ever before. And I'm part of this. I've been very happy. I too believe in evolution, that we should go out there and use this year to explain it to people who are not willing to hear it in the way that we hear it. And we have an opportunity to reintroduce Darwin as a historical figure, a good, kindly man with no desire to be characterized as an atheist. Like Jerry Coyne, the population geneticist at Chicago, who will be engaged in another celebratory event later this year, 2009. Jerry Coyne feels that there's a sense now that books need to be written with the title, Why Evolution is True. We would not have needed to write that book 25 years ago. And myself, I hope that historians can help too. We can also reflect on Darwin's high visibility and his public profile in the year 2009. And perhaps the one thing that has emerged through these 150 years since Darwin published is that we can still keep our sense of humor. And I want to end just with an image here, that we're all able to contemplate the most difficult philosophical issues with a sense of humor. So, happy birthday, Mr. Darwin.